This episode is brought to you by Tekto Gear, TEKTOGEAR.com, a Portland, Maine-based tactical knife company. The knives are created by the CNC process to provide the best precision, functionality, and beauty. The Tekto Gear knives won't cost a half month's rent either. Today, Tekto Gear is giving 15% off the entire purchase. Go to TEKTOGEAR.com. Use the discount code STRIPES. That's STRIPES. Go to tektogear.com and use discount code STRIPES and save 15% off your entire purchase. This is Military Matters. I'm Rod Rodriguez. Back in Season 3, we did 2 episodes about a topic many of you had emailed us to do a story on: the fight between those who live in military housing and the companies that run them. Stars and Stripes reporter Rose Thayer is back with an update on the Tenant Bill of Rights, an agreement between military housing companies and the DoD on 18 tenets that ensure military service members have, quote, safe, quality, and well-maintained housing, end quote. It's also worth noting here that in the same document lies this line, quote, the department, they're talking about the DoD, cannot unilaterally change the terms of the complex public-private partnerships that established the MHPI housing project, end quote. MHPI being the Military Housing Privatization Initiative. That line tells us that the deals are done, the ink is dry, those won't change. But did the Tenant Bill of Rights actually do anything? Before we share Rose's story with you, we thought it would be important to provide context to her update. That's why we're going to suggest you go back and listen to Season 3, Episode 7, Black Mold and Lead in Military Housing, and the Law Letting It Happen. Jack Murphy shares the horror story of one family's fight with their military housing company and the contractual terms that are baked into the contracts that the Tenant Bill of Rights clearly says the DoD cannot unilaterally change. But you'll be shocked at what those terms are, and that the government not only agreed to them, but continues to abide by them. A link to that story will be in the show notes, and I highly recommend you start there. But for this episode, we're going to replay the second part of that story, which was Season 3, Episode 8, A Tenant Bill of Rights and Dead Infants on Fort Bragg. This one will help prime you for next week's update. In this episode you're about to hear, we're talking about some shady environmental testing that may have led to the deaths of infants on Fort Bragg. And we talk with a military spouse who has seen firsthand some of those questionable practices. And we talk about the Tenant Bill of Rights, which at the time of recording was relatively new. That should get you ready for next week's update from Rose Thayer. So here we go. Our replay of a Tenant Bill of Rights and dead infants on Fort Bragg. In our last episode, we talked with Rachel Christian, who shared her family's health issues she attributes to the on-post house she was living in, and how the housing company did little about their mold issues aside from slapping on a new layer of paint. Attorney Rob Mitro also explained how the privatized housing companies are hiding behind a legal loophole they claim protects them from having to abide by any housing or tenant laws made after the land became federal. For example, Fort Bragg became federal land around 1940. These companies are claiming they have zero obligation to abide by tenant or housing laws made after the 40s. In February of 2020, the Military Housing Privatization Initiative Tenant Bill of Rights was signed by then Secretary of Defense Mark Esper and the Secretaries of the Navy, Army, and Air Force. This Bill of Rights claims to commit the DoD to ensuring privatized housing tenants receive quality housing and fair treatment from the military housing property companies that operate and maintain privatized housing. But does this document actually hold anyone accountable?
Well, I think a lot of the standard or the Tenant Bill of Rights provisions were really just ambiguous.
That's Sarah Klein.
I'm a military spouse. We had lived in privatized housing that had issues. We moved to Randolph Air Force Base, had substantial issues. I moved again to West Point, the military academy, and had substantial issues. And by then I realized that this was a national problem and really have dedicated the last 2 years to helping other families still experiencing those problems.
Sarah works with the Military Housing Advocacy Network, a nonprofit group that advocates for safe and healthy military housing. The ambiguous language of the DoD's Tenant Bill of Rights stood out to her, especially the very first one, which has to do with environmental standards. Quote, the right to reside in a housing unit and a community that meets applicable health and environmental standards.
So there's no set standard for, let's say, mold in the United States. There's industry standards, but there's no teeth in this legislation and this Tenant Bill of Rights that says you must file the IICRC standards for mold remediation. And so then you have companies that are going in and following state laws. So the mold remediation efforts that may be happening in New York, where they have really good state mold laws, versus what's happening in Oklahoma, are vastly different, even with the same company.
The DoD's Tenant Bill of Rights also states that tenants have a right to work order histories, but even that is wrapped in ambiguity.
Those work order histories that the families are getting are often vague and minimizing. And one of a recent case with a family that I helped, they had exterior door repair listed on the work order history multiple times. And typically when the family's given the work order history, they're told, if you have any questions or want further information about any of these work orders, please let us know. So exterior door repair wouldn't be one that you would necessarily say, hey, I want more information. But what actually ended up happening with the exterior door is that it was causing water to flood into the utility room. And there was a bunch of mold underneath the flooring. Another case happened where it said dishwasher repair. You would never think, oh, dishwasher repair. It was actually the dishwasher was leaking, and it had leaked so much that it had to be remediated by a professional mold remediation company. So even the ones that have teeth that haven't been fully implemented really aren't helping families on the ground in the way that I think that they were intended to.
And even when the housing companies are willing to provide some level of repair, for example, moldy carpets due to a leaking dishwasher or a faulty door, the repairs come with caveats that make the repair cheaper, but effectively do little to fix the underlying health issues.
My home for mold, it was off the charts, first test.
That's Lee Tuttle. She's the wife of a U.S. Army Special Forces soldier, and she's seen firsthand how corners can get cut with something as simple as replacing a carpet.
They replaced some carpeting, which, is extremely moldy. And when they were pulling it off, even the carpeting pad had mold. And the contractor who was there was like, well, we're not allowed to replace the padding. And I was like, that's ridiculous. Stop. Like, I am not letting you continue if you're going to just put new carpet over this, filthy padding. Which, it's just like these cutting the corners of things that to save, I don't know what, $100. And that's what is kind of like the basis of a lot of these problems that keep occurring.
Remember, these privatized housing companies have been arguing that unless there were specific provisions that mandated replacing that carpet in the first place prior to 1940, they're literally doing you a favor. So they can argue with the tenant about whether they're obligated to replace a moldy carpet pad when they're replacing a moldy carpet. Sarah Klein.
Let's say that we knew that it said exactly, you must follow IICRC standards. They would then come back, and I think we're having the same issue to where the companies don't want to enact certain provisions of the Tenant Bill of Rights because it's not only them having to agree to this. I think that there wasn't teeth in it because they knew that their lenders would also have to agree. So I think that's why it's so vague. And the DoD has stated that they cannot unilaterally change all of the project agreements. And that's why they're having the issues with the remaining provisions.
Lee Tuttle.
It's just a lot of, I would say, like wiggle room for these, companies to argue in their favor, right? There's no standard. There's no standards given. There's no data given in terms of, what is the legal threshold for this? Like, what is, none of that is outlined, right? It's just a standard. Well, whose standard is it? Is it the DODs? Is it federal? Is it, even what is it pertaining to? I think it's just very ambiguous, and it gives them the ability to argue in their favor, right? Because there is no standard. No one can define that standard.
What stuck out to us about the Tenant Bill of Rights is how lacking it is in detail and how far removed from a legal document it reads. Sarah and Lee both expressed their concern that the Tenant Bill of Rights felt more like rhetoric than regulation.
It certainly seems that way, doesn't it? Like, they go into these hearings and the takeaway from it is like, who's in charge here? Like, who's actually running this thing? Because it seems like our government is completely impotent to hold these companies that they contracted with accountable in any way, despite all of the public shaming, that there's actual congressional hearings, a lot of the tough talk, but nothing really changes.
So what about the families who do complain, who do speak up about lead in their water, mold covered by paint, the housing companies cutting corners in their repairs? Sarah Klein.
I know of families that have had their husband's superiors brought in with the garrison commanders and spoken to, and really just been spoken down to and saying, hey, you need to resolve this. You need to get this taken care of. So even the act, and this happened personally to us, the act of the military housing office reaching out to that person's superior, you never know if retaliation is going to occur. Are they going to get put on nighttime duty? Is that what retaliation looks like? Is their OER and COER going to come out and negatively reflect that? It's hard to really pinpoint some of the retaliation.
Have you seen examples of that where it's reflected on an OER or an NCOER?
I know of a case that I'm thinking of right now to where a family believes, two actually, I can think of off the top of my head, where the service member was not promoted, they believe, due to the issues that they had with military housing.
This is a commercial, privatized company with so much pull. They have so much wasta on these posts that they can call up a commander, a uniformed military officer, and get them to retaliate against one of their own men. Like, that's surreal.
Absolutely. I mean, even when we were dealing with our housing issues, it was to the point to where my husband's commander had to be present whenever housing came to our house to do a work order. So even having that request made, how much of a pain is it for that commander to take time out of their day to be present for a work order that needs to be completed?
Lee Tuttle.
So I haven't personally seen any, but again, like, we always have had really supportive commands, but I do hear of things, especially down at MacDill Air Force Base. It sounded like there was quite a bit of retaliation going around there. And it seemed like even, I believe, someone FOIA'd some documents and saw commands and housing kind of speaking poorly about the families in emails, who had been kind of pushing back on the housing issues that they're experiencing.
Ideal for fishing, especially if one needs to quickly cut a line, the Romeo folding knife comes with a light carbon fiber handle with an amazing grip and a D2 steel blade. Fair warning, the blade is extremely sharp and cuts through the toughest materials. What makes it simple is the flipper tab. The knife pops open for quick use all in one single motion. Go to tektogear.com today. Tektogear is giving 15% off the entire purchase. Use discount code STRIPES. That's STRIPES. Go to tektogear.com and use discount code STRIPES and save 15% off your entire purchase. We've talked in the past about the military's culture of perceived perfection, that any boat rocking or deviation from business as usual can be seen as a slight against commanders and their authority. There's also the issue that you'll be scrutinized closely for speaking up, that pushing back against these rich and powerful companies will make your chain of command question your motives, your lifestyle, even how you're managing the affairs of your family. Privacy can go right out the window the moment your chain of command gets involved in your personal and family life. A lot of military families with legit issues quietly waited for a PCS, hoping that the next place would be better.
Yeah, they're counting that you're going to be there 2 to 4 years and move on and put it behind you.
That's exactly part of the problem. Families leave and nothing is resolved in that home or housing unit. Another family moves in and they inherit the same health issues, the same unsafe and unhealthy living conditions. Then they in turn stay quiet for the same reasons. The consequences, though, can be deadly. Lee Tuttle.
From 2007 to 2011, there were 12 infant deaths in homes on Fort Bragg. And 3 of those infants were from 3 separate families, but in the same home. So with that is, there's not a lot of information on it, but the Army did open an investigation, and they said that, it was not, the homes are very safe. We ran these tests. I think the Consumer Product Safety Commission was involved, and they ran some certain tests. But a professor from Columbia University is quoted in one of these articles, and he says, it's statistically impossible for 3 children in the same home to die from SIDS.
Lee is talking about a quote from a 2011 ProPublica article where David Abramson, a professor at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health and director of research for the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, said about the number of infant deaths in the same home that it was enormously unlikely, and that, quote, common sense would dictate there's something common in the environmental exposure.
To my knowledge, those families have received no answers, no sort of justice. And one of the families that's detailed in one of these articles, it talks about how her, infant had died. And when she called the ambulance and the police, they were able to escort the baby to the hospital. But then CPS took their other 3 kids for 4 days away from them because they had to investigate the death. And, they were cleared, but it's just like, what a nightmare for these parents to be going through that and to never receive any answers. And also from, what I read is that there were lots of questions on the validity of the test that they used to test for Chinese drywall in these homes. And to my understanding is that these homes are now demolished on Fort Bragg.
In 2011, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, or CPSC, and the Army released a report on whether contaminated drywall had anything to do with the deaths of the Fort Bragg infants. The report concluded that the drywall was not to blame, but experts who reviewed the report told the Herald Tribune and ProPublica that the tests that were used were, quote, unreliable and incomplete, and that more tests should have been done, end quote. In fact, the one test that should have been done, a chamber test, which is accepted industry-wide as the standard for testing tainted drywall, was not conducted by the CPSC nor the Army. Instead, they elected to measure only certain elements within the drywall. Michael Shaw, then vice president of Interscan Corp., told the Herald Tribune, quote, the idea that they are skating around this and not doing the obvious measurement is very troubling, end quote. Tests and results have a very spotty history with the privatized housing companies and the military. It's not just industry experts scratching their head wondering why the proper tests weren't done, but there are some serious questions even about the laboratories that these companies turn to for test results. Lee Tuttle.
It's interesting when you look at those lab details. It's the lab, they sent my results to Phoenix, Arizona, when there was a lab in Dallas, which was closer. And then looking into that lab, there's a lot of controversy with the labs that they used in terms of falsifying testing. And it was that specific Phoenix, Arizona lab. So I think that there's a lot of things that, it just would take a lot to look into, right? There's so many layers to this, and it's been going on for so long. And people know, the Garrison knows, the politicians know now. It's like, what do we do? I think it's just going to take the, American public to really see the bigger picture of how this is affecting the, health of the service members and their families, but also, readiness, right? Like it's a stressful situation when your family's not happy and there's nothing you can do.
Sarah Klein.
Well, I think Congress was initially really motivated to enact legislation and mandate the Tenant Bill of Rights. And what they found out with the last 4 provisions being implemented slowly or not unilaterally is they are being told by the DoD that they don't have the power to do so, that these are all in the contract legal agreements that not only the military housing company, but their lender has to approve in order to enact this legislation. So the argument is, if this agreement or contract is now against current law, must they change it? And the DoD, I think, is essentially saying, well, we can't make them. We're sorry, Congress. So I don't know where to go from here, other than I do know that the MHPI agreements do have an option for the military to take back the housing. The cost for them to do so is so much that I don't think that anyone's realistically considering that at this point. But without those agreements being rewritten and rescinded, I don't know that there's any hope for military families to really live in a safe home and not be abused by their landlord.
Well, I've been covering this issue off and on for maybe 3 years now. So a lot of this information is not necessarily surprising to me, although there are bits and pieces that were surprising. It's surprising to me not that these companies are now arguing that they are only liable under laws from the 1940s. I mean, that's pretty shocking. But I think the larger story in it is how long it takes the military or our government to change the trajectory of the ship, how long it takes to turn this thing around. We see that in the military all the time with all sorts of different policies that get implemented, and then it takes decades to reverse them. It takes a long, long time for the bureaucracy to shift gears. The problem is that we're not talking about even developing a new fighter jet or a new form of tactics that we want the infantry to use in combat, or a new administrative software that we're trying to implement in the force. What we're talking about here is actually much more dire in one sense, that this is literally killing children, military children on bases, on military installations. And in that dire situation, it's not acceptable for the bureaucracy to take decades to correct course. It has to be done as quickly as possible. Like this, if there's something to put a rush on, this is it. There should be an emergency program instituted to make sure that these families are taken care of, and that these houses are either demolished and replaced, or some sort of complete modernization, refurbishment put into place. I don't know. I'm not the expert on these subjects. I'm not a carpenter or a mold expert, but there does need to be some sort of emergency program put into place to protect military families. What's happening, what they're going through is unacceptable, and it's equally unacceptable for our government and our military to take 10 to 20 years to pull their collective heads out of their ass.
We want to thank Rachel Christian, Rob Mitro, Sarah Klein, Lee Tuttle, and Stripes reporter Rose Thayer for their help in putting these 2 episodes together. Leave us a review and a 5-star rating on whatever podcast player you use. Those reviews really do help us reach a new audience. And be sure to share this podcast. We grow through word of mouth. You can find Military Matters everywhere you listen to podcasts, or go to stripes.com and click on the podcast tab. We're always free to listen to. Use promo code podcast and save 50% on your digital subscription to Stars and Stripes. Send your story ideas and tips to militarymatters@stripes.com. And be sure to follow us on Twitter @StripesMMPod. I'm Rod Rodriguez.
I'm Jack Murphy.
We'll see you at the next episode. This episode is brought to you by Tektogear, TEKTOGEAR.com, a Portland, Maine-based tactical knife company. The knives are created by the CNC process to provide the best precision, functionality, and beauty. The Tektogear knives won't cost you half a month's rent either. Today, Tektogear is giving 15% off the entire purchase. Go to TEKTOGEAR.com. Use discount code STRIPES. That's STRIPES. Go to Tektogear.com and use discount code STRIPES and save 15% off your entire purchase.